Welcome to grammar class, unit number 8. This is Heidi Holycross-Lui, and you are watching a video where we will discuss the topics in unit 8. We will cover the present perfect using since and for. This is the unit overview. For each video, we will have one of these slides that covers everything we're going to talk about in this video. So today we're talking about the present perfect, which describes an action that began in the past and it continues into the present. It may even continue into the future, but it doesn't have to. We're going to use two specific words with this. The first one is since, which is when something started, and for, which is how long something has been happening. We will also talk about the form, which is have or has, plus the past participle. We will go over this in more detail throughout the chapter, and if you feel you need to pause so that you can see the video longer and read what's on the screen, feel free to pause it at any time. On your screen now, we have some example sentences. Go ahead and pause and read them to yourselves. Let's look at the first two sentences. Bob has lived in California since 1995, and Kelly has worked at the University of Northern Colorado since 2001. If you look carefully at the first two sentences, what do you think since expresses? Go ahead and pause and think about it for a minute. If you said that since expresses when something began, great job! That is exactly what it means. If you didn't figure it out, that's okay. We'll have plenty of time for reviewing and learning about this skill. Let's go ahead and look at the second two sentences. His friends have lived in Brazil for 30 years. Jessica and her husband have traveled for 6 years. What do you think for expresses in these two sentences? Go ahead and pause the video and try to figure it out, what it means to you. If you remembered that for expresses how long something has been happening, great job! You got it perfectly. If you didn't, that's okay. That's why you're watching the video, so you can learn about this skill. Now we're going to talk more specifically about the form for the present perfect. If you look at the phrases that are underlined, it can tell you how you form it. The examples are has lived, has worked, have lived, and have traveled. How do you form the present perfect? Go ahead and write it down. The present perfect is formed by the subject, and then you have or has, plus the past participle. We use have with plural subjects. So if you look at the last two sentences, his friends and Jessica and her husband, these are plural subjects, and you use have. You also use it with I have lived or I have worked. You use has with singular subjects. Bob has lived, Kelly has worked. Let's talk more about past participles. This may be the first time you've ever heard this type of verb, but it's the third form of the verb. For regular verbs, both the simple past and the past participle add ed. For irregular, you'll need to memorize the forms. Here are some of the common types of past participles. Go ahead and pause and study this form for a little bit. If there are more in the back of your book, in the appendix, I'll show you where that is in class. Like all verb tenses, there's a negative form for this present perfect tense. Go ahead and spend some time reading the sentences, and then we'll talk about how you form the negative present perfect. Go ahead and write down the pattern as you can guess from this slide. Let's look more carefully at these sentences. Bob and Jen have not married. They haven't married. Bob has not called his mother for 2 weeks. Jen hasn't been home since 2009. They haven't gone to Mexico for 3 years. So if you guessed correctly that you have the subject plus have or has plus not plus the past participle, great job. You should be really proud of yourself. If you didn't guess that, that's okay too. We'll get better at that. Like most tenses, there are also question forms. Here, go ahead and pause the video and study the first 3. These are yes/no questions, and I want you to write down the pattern you find. So go ahead and do that right now. So, has he won any prizes? Have you called your mother? Has she walked to school? All 3 of these yes/no questions form the present perfect in the same way. You either have or has plus the subject and then the past participle. Remember, in question forms, you always switch the first part of the verb with the subject. So here, the have or has goes first. Let's look at the last 2 sentences. These are WH questions, even though neither one of them actually starts with a WH word. But here they are. How long have they been in California? How often have they traveled to Utah? How do you form WH word questions with the present perfect? Go ahead and pause and try to figure it out on your own. The answer will be in the next slide. If you figured out that the WH word comes first, and then you have, and then the subject, and then the past participle, great job! You have good detective skills. If you didn't figure it out, it's okay too. We'll keep reviewing this in class. So you have how long or how often, have, and then the subject, and then the past participle. Well, if you have questions, then you must have answers, right? So here are the types of answers and the patterns that you can use to answer these types of questions. If you look at the first 3, the yes/no questions, obviously you use a yes or no answer. So no, he hasn't, yes, he has, or no, I haven't, yes, I have. If you look at the last 2 questions, those give you specific answers. They're asking for more detail, so you will go ahead and add more detail. Normally, you'll use a word with since or for, depending on what type of question you had. Alright, so let's talk more about the meaning. We spent some time talking about the form, but it's important to know what that form means. So if you look at the timeline, it's talking about several years of when I lived in Colorado and when I moved here. So if you look at the top 2 sentences, I have lived in Fort Collins since 2007, and the sentence right below it, I have lived in Fort Collins for 5 years. These sentences have the same meaning. The second group of sentences also have the same meaning. I have worked at UNC since last year. I have worked at UNC for about a year. Let's look some more at this timeline. If you look at the arrow, it begins in 2007 and it continues into the present, right? Living in Fort Collins. The meaning of these sentences means that living in Fort Collins began in the past. Obviously, 2007 happened in the past. Right now, I am living in Fort Collins, so that's the present. And I will probably live in Fort Collins tomorrow, So that's the future. It doesn't have to go into the future, but the sentence does go into the future. Let's look more specifically at the words since and for. Right now we're going to talk about since, but in a minute we'll talk about for. So remember that since talks about when something began. So here you have since plus a point in time. Since July or since spring. You can also use dependent clauses. If you look at the last two examples, since I graduated, since my husband moved to the United States, these are sort of like sentences, right? They're dependent clauses. They have a subject and a verb that's in the simple past. You can put the since phrase at the end of the clause or at the beginning. These two example sentences have the same meaning. Since my husband moved to the United States, he has learned English. My husband has learned English since he moved to the United States. Let's look at for. For expresses a length of time. For 5 years, for a week, for 2 months, for a long time. Here, you can't use a dependent clause. You have to have for plus a number or a phrase that expresses the idea of time. You can put the for phrase at the end or at the beginning, but it is much more common at the end. So I have lived in Fort Collins for 5 years. For 5 years, I have lived in Fort Collins. These two sentences mean the same thing. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you learned about using since and for with the present perfect. This is Heidi Holycross-Lui signing off for the University of Northern Colorado. Have a good day. We'll talk more about this tomorrow in class.